with the panel discussion. Well, thank you very much, Rohit, Deepa, and Orion Black Swan, everyone, for inviting me and having this. I'm delighted to be here, delighted to be part of this panel. And I'm also very happy to be associated with this book. I just heard Professor Sen say that it's a good book, which I promise you is high praise. I was deeply relieved to hear that he thought so, because I too think it's a good book. I also think it's a very important book. So I'm very happy that there are all of you here today to be able to get a glimpse of it and that we have such an eminent panel to discuss this. But I want to first begin by asking Professor Sen to perhaps share some of his views, his thoughts, not on just the book, but on the 5 years that we have just experienced in India.
All right, thank you very much. I think it's a very good book for many points of view. Primarily enlightenment. We learn a lot about what's been going on in India, which is not clear, either because of lack of data, or primarily because of lack of analysis of the data. I think there's a tendency sometimes, which is actually present even in the book, to say that when in 2014 the Modi government came to office, there was a huge expectation. I don't think there was a huge expectation at that time, because the nature of the program was fairly well known. And I think we have to see to what extent the problems that we see were not because things got derailed, but because things were on the rail. I think there are two types of issues here. There is what I would call standard classical right-wing economics. I'm being fairly straightforward in calling it right-wing. You can discuss it in a more sophisticated way and describe it in some other way, but primarily taking the view that it's the expansion of capital and the owners of capital and their lifestyle that drive an economy, and others get things out of that which results from it. If that's a way of thinking about standard right-wing economics, it, by the way, stands in conflict with what I would regard as mainstream economics. Going back to Adam Smith, often Adam Smith is described as the first pro-market economist. The fact is that he took an approach which wasn't like that at all. He took an approach whereby you had to expand the lives of everyone and their opportunity to work, their ability to work, their capability to function, advance them, and he therefore emphasized education, healthcare, in addition to creating opportunity for the market economy, that too. But it fitted into a bigger story. Now, that story is pretty strong. At one stage, Adam Smith discusses why is it that we want high economic growth. I was thinking of it when the introduction was going on. And he said there are two reasons why growth is important. One is that it increases the income of everyone, and everyone is important here, and they are therefore able to do things that they can do with money which they couldn't without money. And secondly, it increases the income of the government, and the government can do, or the commonwealth as he put it, do things which only the government can do. And that includes the example education, and in the rest of the book he also discusses healthcare, social security, and so on. So there was that balance. So when I talk about right-wing economics, it's somewhat to lose that balance and take the view somehow one part of it who is going to take over and really run things, and you don't have to worry the other, whether you call it by such disgusting names as there are many terms for it, like what is it that people get not left over.
No, he's thinking of something else.
Neoliberalism is a word I don't use, because when somebody describes another person as neoliberal, you know only one thing about it, that the first person does not like the second person. Barring that, there is no descriptive context to neoliberalism that I've been able to discover. No, there is a term, exclusionary. I can't, not left over, but
exclusionary.
No, what is it that the poor get when the
Trickle down.
Trickle down.
huh?
Trickle
Trickle down? That's it. Trickle down. So even without using such a disgusting term as trickle down, it's actually the whole image is terrible, and it's not a good way of thinking about economics. But it's not just right-wing economics. Along with that, what you have in the government policies is what I would call magic. Great faith in magic. I mean, I've reminded of a time when in school in Shantiniketan we had a visitor and they asked us about who is the greatest person we think, and there was a division between Mahatma Gandhi and Rammanohar Reddy, but somebody said PC sarkar. And there was a bit, I think demonetization is straight out of the PC sarkar. I mean, this whole idea that by destroying currency, you will certainly make the country enormously rich. I mean, it really boggles the mind to see how you could have got there. I had, in one of the interviews, said something, there was some example on autarky or something like that, and then all the newspapers jumped on me, saying, how could I have used such an expression? I mean, that was an understatement, really, or something. Would be, there is something going on there. But the biggest magic was, of course, the demonetization. And there were many others. The whole idea that just doing finance, you can make an economy, real economy, bigger, stronger, and you don't lose anything. Of course, if as anti-Adam Smithian a thought as you can get, the Adam Smithian thought will be that in order to make the country productive, people have to be educated, they have to be healthy. That's the natural one. By the way, to some extent this applies even, not as much as the pure magic of the last 5 years, but even to the idea that simply giving out people cash is going to make the whole economy richer, just misses out that the economy is about the real world, and that includes people being able to read and write, to be able to follow instructions, like a standard Chinese or Korean worker to be able to read instructions and have quality control, as a result of which the Chinese labor can produce almost any commodity in the world, and we can still produce 2 or 3. And I'm not saying, could that we make tea? Could that we make information technology? good that we make some pharmaceuticals. I couldn't quite find out, for some reason we can make motor parts. But whatever it is, I think that was true 4 or 5 years ago. But that's not, I mean, almost anything that I hold, there's watch, there's fountain pen, can be made in China. I often made in China. And it's not a problem at all. Now, so I think the economy suffered a lot from belief in magic. Now, in addition to standard writing economics. Now, we're discussing this, I think one of the articles, by the way, this is really good collection of articles. I'm not going to talk about each of them individually, but one of them, I've forgotten which one, says, well, there are two aspects of Modi. There is he came in as a kind of development guru, and he came in also as a Hindutva leader. But he said, I'm not going to discuss the latter so much, it's the former. And to some extent for this book, that's right. But you know, I think they are very closely related. And I would say how they are closely related. The idea of progress being progress for some, but not for others. This is a kind of, there is an element of religiosity in general on it, but I think we have been very unfortunate in this country, and despite all the great things that ancient Hindu taught, ancient Buddhist taught, ancient Jain taught us. But this basic lack of egalitarianism and this basic belief that some people's progress is like everybody's progress is something that can be rooted way back to our thinking. In fact, even I'm a great believer, by the way, in the Vedas, and spent a lot of time reading it. But their favorite parts of Vedas are not the ones that are quoted there to do with why it's possible that there is no God. This is Mandala 10 discussion, the Song of Creation, or the lament of the gambler, which is also Rig Veda. Oddly, you think it would be Atharva Veda, but it's not. It's Rig Veda. And where he said also, if I become rich, there's a great richness all around. Now, that's the kind of thought. And by the way, those are lovely stories, lovely verses about the gambler in Rig Veda, saying that I know it's wrong, and yet when there is a gambling going on, if I see it, I cannot resist joining it. It's a thought that the Greeks call akrasia, weakness of the will. And I think, and this is of course much earlier than the Greek akrasian discussion. So it is, if Indians are going to play up the great achievement of Vedas, it's not the mathematics of Aryabhata and Brahmagupta, who came about 2,000 years later, that you ought to talk about. You ought to talk about akrasia and other ideas that flourish. Now, I think this number game is really important, because, and that's why I think Hindutva is important in this context. I know that when the newspapers are present, almost anything one says is going to be distorted tomorrow morning. But I'm not saying that there are not great things in Hindu philosophy. In fact, oddly enough, my first book was on that subject.
It's tragic that you have to say this at all.
Well, yeah, but so happened that my grandfather, who wrote the most successful English book on Hinduism, namely the Penguin Hinduism, which went to, I don't know, 40, 50 edition. He wrote it. It was a bad translation. I retranslated it, and then he died. And I had to see the book through, Penguin. And so my first book was a book on, it's called Hinduism. But it also discusses everything, including the Ganda and the song of creation and all those things. But there are so many extraordinarily interesting things. But the fact is, there is a kind of, in at least parts of it, there's a tolerance of inequality and tolerance of judging progress by what's happening to the most successful people. It's opposite. In game theory, they sometimes have what's called maximin, that you maximize the position of the worst of individuals. And quite often, this is maximax. If you judge what's happening to society by what's happening to the most fortunate of them. And you see that, and there's quite a lot of these things in it, including some of the early charts indicate that some people are doing quite very well. And that certainly has happened. There's no question about that. I think the problems are exactly there. Namely, we get a lot of people very well educated. They get educated and they run the Microsoft, run the Google, run the Deutsche Bank, and you could say, my God, it's a country with excellent education. And yet there are people who in the 8th grade cannot divide or multiply. They don't know that there is a single school to which they can go, which is reliable, which is affordable. I mean, that's why this private school idea is so difficult, even if when you try to combine it with income subsidies. And the biggest, of course, is the healthcare problem. Think of the Ayushman. If you happen to be living and have a problem when you are 40, you want to get your appendix changed or something else, removed, costs money, you can't pay for it, then you can go to a private hospital and the government will pay for it. But if you have died at the age of 1, 2, or 3, not to mention 3 months, you're not there at all. So what India needed was a radical change in primary health care. The whole of the health thing, and this is not just the BJP, by the way, this was true under the UPA government as well. RSBY, Rashtriya Shastra Yojana, was invented by the previous government. That's also income subsidy, mostly to private hospitals, and in a way that it creates incentives for them to even invent disease which don't exist. We looked at the number of young girls who are told that they have to have hysterectomy to something that's really important, because it's an expensive operation and you get some money and you do make a big profit. You can't think of something within just standard economic terms. By the way, my name may be Mud in GNU, I am a mainstream economist. And mainstream economics tells you this is not a good way of having incentive compatibility. It gives the wrong incentive, it covers the wrong population who needs less than the people who are either dead or they can't have food when they're young, or who can't get an X-ray when they have a problem, and who can't get any kind of dietary supplement when they're young. It aims at the wrong population and it's not incentive compatible. Now, suddenly I'm told, and when I was talking with some people in some of my very sensitive friends among Indians in 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 in, in America, that now that health is covered for all with Ayushman. Ayushman doesn't even try to do it, and if you think of a quantum leap in the wrong direction, you can't think of a bigger example than that. We needed the money. You see, the point is made, and the book makes the point too clearly. India spent about 1% of the GDP on public health care. China spent about 2.5 to 3%. Many countries spend more than that. India is one of the lowest. But that's not the only problem. That is a problem. It's not the only problem, because that 1% goes mostly to hospitals to do specialist care if you have survived through your early dangers of dying, prenatal, postnatal or infant. And that's completely going in the wrong direction. Now, I've already been saying that there is some connection between the Hindutva psychology and the exclusion, because numbers don't matter. That's not the general Hindu position, but it can be made to, and you're quite right to one that it's sad that I have to say it, but I have to say it because tomorrow morning I was here, I'll say the opposite. India did produce Buddha. India did produce enormous skepticism of magic. Lokayata, as publishing, I'm trying to write a memoir. I mentioned when I had cancer at the age of 18, why some thoughts from Lokayata was very helpful for me. But Lokayata was takes you back about 8th century BC. Buddha in the 6th century BC thought to be his intellectual equal, the Lokayata and the Charvaka, rather than the thief. Indeed, a great book, 14th century, written by a great philosopher called Madhavacharya, 18-chapter book called Sarvadasan Shankara, collection of all philosophy, begins with Lokayata as the first chapter. The pattern is you explain a position sympathetically, the best that could be said about it. The next chapter attacks it and takes a different position. And the sequence is Lokayata, and the second chapter is Buddha. And it proceeds like that. And Buddha did spend more time, he was an agnostic, not an atheist, arguing why the agnostic position was superior to the atheistic position, and why materialism alone is not sufficient. But interestingly, among Buddha's argument was you would never know whether there is a God or not. And secondly, and this is really the important thing, in order to have the incentive to do good things, you don't need a God. You don't need the assumption of God. Not that he doesn't exist, but you don't need him in order to do the right thing. So I think all that was part of our heritage, So that goes against magic, it goes against demonetization. Uh, and it also goes against judging progress by the life of some people and not others. But then comes the really, the I think the most uh, problematic aspect of the Hindutva approach, namely the issue of treatment of lower caste untouchables and the and the and the and the tribes. And of course, it's one of those cases where it's not only that you could ignore some people, you identify who is it that you could ignore. It's the low caste, it's the lower touchables, and so on. Now I comment in my memoir the debate between Mahatma Gandhi and Ravindranath, when Mahatma Gandhi made a statement, which I believe a wrong statement, namely that at the time of the Bihar earthquake in January 1934, that it was God's punishment for untouchability. And Tagore was very upset about it, so was Nehru and others, and saying that this is a very unscientific statement. But if you look at it, and I do try to go into it, what he is trying to do is judge almost everything in terms of the manifest, the biggest neglect. That's what Gandhiji is doing. Namely, what is if there was a cause, and as Gandhiji said, a man like me has to think in these terms, that there has been some cause of it. What is the worst thing that's happening? And he's identifying the worst thing as untouchability. That's what he's doing. And what we have in neglect of education and healthcare, of course, precisely the neglect of these groups, who don't have they also don't often have the money, but primarily they don't have the social status, they don't have the opportunity, they don't live in the right areas, they don't have the right friends. If they do something wrong, unlike you and me, they are picked up the police. I shouldn't say that in GNU because lots of people have been picked up by the police here. And sedition seems to be a very common action in GNU. I'm very impressed by how common sedition is in this university. It's quite a difficult term. You have to be, you want to overthrow the government in a violent way. The fact that the university has been able to find so many seditious people here is really extraordinary credit to a search operation. So I think there is a connection between numbers don't matter, and worse than that, some people don't matter. And if you look what's gone wrong, why is the quantum leap in the wrong direction, is that instead of correcting it, we have what's happened in the last few years is to solidify it. You can say lots of bad things about China, and I'm happy to say that China ought to have a democracy, ought to have elections, should have a freer press, and so on. But the fact is, you don't have a situation where some people systematically don't have facilities like basic schooling and basic healthcare that others standardly do as a matter of right. Being poor in China is very different from being poor in India. Being poor in India is not to know whether there is a school or where there is a school that you can send your children to, where there is a hospital or medical center where you can get some kind of relief. That's not the nature of poverty in China. Poverty in China is that you don't have enough money, and that's why I think ultimately, even though it's very popular now, this whole idea of giving people money with some kind of universal basic income is going to solve the problem. Because the problem isn't only the lack of money. The problem is the nature of the society that had rotten features, and what has been particularly upsetting is that those terrible features have been quantumly magnified. And if you want to move away from that, and I hope an opportunity will come to do that, not very long from now, if that happens, we have to begin not by saying what we can do more, what has been already doing, like trying to give more money, uh, calculate your income and calculate the minimum wage and the gap you fill up. Uh, I think you need a radical change in society, education, healthcare, social security, and ultimately the way we view each other. It's the fact. Ultimately, the dignity of man, which really, man and woman, which is ultimately what's involved in that. Thank you.
Professor Sen speak, which I have now been hearing for decades. It is the extraordinary excursus into philosophy and all kinds of other things that that actually is so enlightening. But there's one very important aspect of what he's talked about, which is that it's not that it's an intensification of some of the worst features of our society, which have also translated into how we've dealt with the economy. I want to ask Ram about this, because the book also suggests this, that in some ways we are a much more fragile economy than we were 5 years ago. And that fragility, of course, has many aspects, which are all excellently highlighted in this book. But then there was that massive thing of demonetization, which kind of expressed, and he's defined it beautifully as this belief in magic. But perhaps it was even more than that, right? You've written very well about this, so I wondered whether you wanted to just bring that up a bit.
Yeah, about demonetization, to build on what Professor Sen said, magic, or if you call it black magic, it was something more than that. I mean, if you look at demonetization 2 years later, one thing that worries you is that it seems to be fading from public discourse. That is worrying. And the bigger worry, there are three aspects to demonetization. The fact that it could be thought of against all sane advice, two, the way it was implemented, and the way the objectives were shifted all the time. And the third, which should worry us now, was that there's been no accountability at all for what was a very wrong decision, for which none of the objectives were met, however you define them, whether it's black money or digitalization or whatever. And yet at the end of it, 2 years later, nobody is answerable for that. I mean, not the RBI, not the Finance Ministry, not the Prime Minister's office. And there, there have been much speculation, whichever way you look at, why was it done? I mean, there is no sane answer that one can really give to that. And sometimes it worries you that this was done at the height of the power of a government. And was it done to show, to demonstrate the arbitrary power of the government? That, look, I can do what I want, I can hit you where you want, so you be careful. So I think, looking back, that's something that we need to worry about. And as far as the economic consequences of demonetization, I think they are still with us. They may not, cash may return to the system, etc. But in terms of disruption to agriculture, I think much of what you see now, disruption in markets, fallen prices, can be traced to that time. And what has happened in the informal sector, that the loss of jobs, the unemployment rates that Rohit presented from the MSS data, the spike, all of that can be traced to that time. The recovery, in a sense, is just superficial. The unfortunate part is that we don't have hard information, or rather, the hard information that is there is being suppressed or pushed aside. But all indications are that 2.5 years later, demonetization is still with us, and we have to, I think, first make those who implemented that decision accountable for that. I mean, really look at it. I can't think of a single decision in the past 70 years, or the favorite thing now, the first 55 years, whatever. That, somebody has to answer at some time, but on this nothing. And this was a really earthquake of a decision, if you want to call it. So that's one aspect. The other is the economic aspects are still with us, and by not acknowledging them, I think this government which relies so much, I would use the word, phrase management of the image, has done so much to kind of push it aside, and it's our job in the sense as citizens to keep the issue alive, in the sense to ask for answers and ask that the consequences be addressed in some form.
Thanks so much, Ram. You mentioned the idea of a government that can do anything it wants. And in a way, I think what we're observing today is a government that cannot just do anything it wants, but can exercise greater and greater control over its citizens. This is a book about a quantum leap in the wrong direction. We seemed at one point, Gopal, to be moving towards greater sense of individual privacy, the Supreme Court judgment, things like that. It now appears as if we are moving much more back into a surveillance and monitoring state. There is some discussion of that in this book, but this is something I think which is also strongly linked to what Professor Sen was saying in terms of the things you can get away with, and Ram was saying, the things you can get away with as a government. How would you respond to that?
As somebody who has no economics in him, I remember a book which appeared in the late 50s, early 60s, by a woman. Individual is at the heart of so much of Amartya Babu's labors, and somewhere in the statistic lurks a human being, and that is what makes education, health, access to public services crucial to all that Amartya Babu has been teaching us. Now, that individual is in danger today. I'll explain. Going by the title, a quantum leap in the wrong direction, kind of a quantum leap in towards the back, which is orthopedically impossible, ideologically suspect, but very visible in reality. Now, yes, now, Aurangzeb thought of people in large groups. So there was one group which had the jizya imposed on it. Dara Shikoh thought of individuals and wrote something for the mingling of the oceans, bringing them together, individuals. Now, Tagore, whom Amartya Babu referred to, has this song which Gandhi interiorized, Akla Cholore. Now, Akla Cholore has become famous because of the opening line, but it is the second line in which he says, Jodi tor dakshuni keo na, if nobody hears your call. Now, which is that unheard call in the whole story of this book that we are talking about. That individual whose call is not being heard was at the heart of Ambedkar's philosophy when he said no to the district as the unit of the constitution, district being the absolute ultimate of the British Raj's systems. No to the gram, which was Gandhiji's village ideal, but the individual. The individual should be the unit. And that is why he made extraordinary fact which we don't realize very often. The election commission and the election machinery in India have been put into the constitution itself, in which the individual as the voter, as the supreme sovereign of the ballot booth, is the heroine or the hero. Now that individual today had a great opportunity given to her or him through the Right to Information Act, and we have Wajahat in the audience today. The Right to Information Act was empowering the individual who has got the vote to also send out that call so that a dakshuni happens. Now the RTI Act today is in the ICU. Virtually, rejection rates have spiraled. And not only have rejection rates spiraled in terms of figures, but as Wajahat was explaining, it is in the first office itself where the individual's letter is received that it gets rejected. Even before it has had the chance to be fully excavated and explored and sent to somebody higher up who can then look at it and say, no, this rejection is wrong, there is something. The RTI Act is in the ICU. Aadhaar. The individual has become a number. Now we have a fascination for numbers in India. Vishnu has to have 1,000 names. Numbers from Vishnu onwards have fascinated us. But today the individual in Aadhaar is a number. But it doesn't matter if that number was a number and an adjunct to a person. The person has become an adjunct to the number. And the problem is, the person who was supposed to get a key through Aadhaar has become the lock which other keys can open. Privacy. A huge step forward, like the RTI. The Supreme Court's judgment on privacy is something which made, I could use that word, Amartya, liberal in a positive way. Every liberal was delighted, and every human being who was not a liberal became aware of a certain right to privacy. But that privacy which makes the individual as conceived by Ambedkar, as sung of by Tagore, that individual has suddenly become vulnerable to a host of invasions, of which I'll mention only two. Prashantji is here, and so I must say that Rafale has become so important in people's mind. When the Rafale matter was agitating the Lok Sabha, quietly the DNA bill got passed. Opposition had walked out, and during that walkout lull, the DNA bill was passed. What is the DNA? Can there be anything more intimate to a person than the DNA? Now, it is not just for forensic purposes. There is going to be a national DNA bank. I think this is something which would have made Dr. Ambedkar go into disbelief. And we have 10 agencies empowered to go into computers. And moving across to a completely different realm. These are things which have been done in the last 5 years. Something has not been done. And something not been done not just in the last 5 years, but even by the UPA 2, UPA 1, which is our ratifying the signature to the UN Convention Against Torture. Now, torture is not theory. Torture is as real as fingernails that have been pulled out. Now, if India, thanks to Inder Gujral's, again, liberal views as Prime Minister, is signed, UN conventions have no meaning unless they are ratified. UPA 2 did not ratify, UPA 1 did not ratify, now also it is not. But now, I must say Dr. Manmohan Singh brought it almost close to ratification and to the adoption of a local bill, by a domestic bill, without which ratification of the Torture Act does not have any meaning. But now we have been told that we will amend the IPC section 330, which makes confessions under duress not valid. We'll amend that, we'll augment that. And so anything to do with the individual today has been subsumed in large steps like Garib identification, the individual as supreme. in the body politic is vital for any examination of economic statistics and for any reflection on the reality of human rights, which are...
The last 5 years are different. In a way, I mean, Amartya was suggesting that it's an extension of the worst features of the earlier period. I think that's also true.
The whole scope of democracy, of dissent. And I would say this is evident most strikingly, for example, I mean, there's also a very strong attempt to establish eventually a one-party state, which I think is reflected in this rather, in this notion of Congress Mukt Bharat. Now, of course, the Congress, when it was ruling, was also quite arrogant, but never did they actually propose the idea of an opposition-free Bharat. And here, I think it's not just Congress-free, but they're really, they would eventually want an opposition, reducing, so to speak, the role of state in public services. And as Professor Sen said, that is most evident in the health scheme and Ayushman Bharat. But I think the real difference, and I'll end with that, the real difference really is not so much in the nature of the state, but in the nature of the ruling party that is governing this state. And if I may say, this collection, while it is an excellent and a wonderful collection which so effectively exposes, so to speak, exposes inconvenient facts about the government, nonetheless seems to be making a distinction, perhaps for heuristic purposes, between development and Hindutva. And my point really is that the real difference has to do, and this is a problem with Indian scholarship on the BJP, and there's a whole industry now. I mean, scholarship on BJP is on an industrial scale, and yet I think most scholarship seems to treat BJP as a normal party. And my contention is that BJP is not an ordinary right-wing party. It is very different from right-wing parties in other parts of the world. For example, you cannot really compare the BJP to the Republicans in the United States, or to the Tories in Britain, or even the far-right parties in European countries, or perhaps in some of the Asian countries. And the reason for the difference, and I think this is the real difference in response to Jayati's question, is the uniqueness, I think, of the BJP lies in the very unique relationship between the BJP and the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh. That is what really defines the BJP. Can we really even begin to understand this government or understand the party which is ruling us without taking into account this unique relationship between the BJP and the RSS? There isn't any other right-wing party in any other part of the world which is informed by this very unique relationship. And I think the second difference, which again has already been hinted at, which follows from the point that I've just made, is that I think while there is so much that is wrong with this government, but as I think Professor Sen also suggested very much in the beginning, that I think it was a mistake to think that they would be going in any other direction than the direction in which they have been going backwards, as that might be. And I think that again has to do, and in that sense this is, if you will, there is an element of success here, and that is again but how do we account for BJP's dominance? I think we can only account for BJP's dominance if we understand that there is, again, I mean, the conflation between Hinduism and nationalism. That is really the key to their success, and, if you will, a conflation between Hindutva and development. I think this is what really makes the BJP so different. So while it is a right-wing government, but it's a right-wing government with a difference.
Okay. So we've had some absolutely fascinating statements and interventions, and I don't want to deprive. We have a very interesting audience here. I can see many people here who would have a lot to say. So I would open it up now if there are any questions or issues that you'd like to raise. I don't know if there's a roving mic.
Now, I actually take a similar position to that of Eric Hobsbawm, namely that any kind of divisiveness that nationalism presents is ultimately a bad thing. But that doesn't mean that it's in every context a bad thing. It depends on the context. That is, basically if you take the view, and that's the view that as a Marxist Hobsbawm was taking, that ultimately it's a humanist position, that all human beings deserve to be treated in the same, with similar respect as every other, then what you have to look at is whether nationalism in a particular context is dividing things up, chopping them up, or getting them together. When there's a Hindu-Muslim riot taking place, asking for nationalism, and in that sense Mahatma Gandhi was a nationalist, is a uniting move. It's taking you towards equality of all humanity. When there's a debate going on about Rohingyas and the allegedly native Burmese, Rohingyas are being separated out, and in that context clearly Burmese nationalism is a negative thing. When you're fighting, when in the First World War, when I arrived in Trinity College as a student, I had a really terrible experience on the first day. I went to the chapel to see, and I couldn't believe that the walls were really covered, all the walls of the chapel, with fallen Trinity men. These are the people who died in the First World War. There was no room left for the Second World War. That has to be put in the anti-chapel. But to believe that so many people could die from one college, from one age group, in 4 years, it's absolutely difficult to think. And what was it about? It was about nationalism in Britain and Germany and France. In that context, clearly nationalism is a real evil. On the other hand, in the context of debates in today's Europe, I think Brexit is that kind of bad nationalism. But to say that an immigrant in Germany or France or Britain belongs to the same nation is a uniting one. So I would take out nationalism as a category and pitch it on humanism as the thing to look at. And whenever nationalism is helping a broad humanitarian approach, I would say it's a positive thing. And when it's doing the opposite, and when, like right now, we're not supposed to discuss it, there's a tension going on between a neighboring country and this one, when all the nationalist thoughts are unleashed, it must have negative aspects, and you cannot deny that. So I think ultimately I would like to take nationalism out of the story altogether, to say is it pro-humanist or is it anti-humanist? That's the way I look at it.
I
think it is probably useful to make a distinction which is, I think in the context of your question, it might be useful to make a distinction, although it is often made, but I think it might still be worth emphasizing, between nationalism and patriotism. I think nationalism is a political ideology, whereas patriotism is, I think, love for your country and loving its people. However, as Professor Sen just said, that if nationalism can be inclusive and humanist and democratic, then I suppose that is all right. But basically, I think, I like the idea of being, I certainly am patriotic, and I like the idea of being patriotic, but now nationalism there are just so many issues at present that it has become a somewhat problematic concept, precisely because if let us say the BJP can with such ease redefine nationalism as Hindu nationalism, then there is clearly a problem.
Other questions? Yes, this young man there.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. It's something that I think for 5 years many of us have struggled with. To try and understand the messages that are being sent out, you can see that a lot of it is, as I said earlier, management of the message, management of the media. But I think it's something more than that, because underlying that is, our developments and trends which tend to give that message a certain concreteness, seem to give it a certain concreteness. Like for example, we have spoken a lot about this afternoon about exclusionary growth of the past 4-5 years, for example. And then you also have, for example, this Swachh Bharat mission. Okay, yes, it is not something radically new. It builds on something that was there the previous 20-30 years. Okay, in spite of all the messages that we sent out, we still know that there's openification that is taking place. But, and that's important, this government has given it a certain attention that no other government in the previous 50-60 years did. It was something as elemental as your privacy during defecation. Okay? They spent a lot of money, they spent, on sort of publicity, etc. So that's just one example. Some of the other things that Deepa, for example, mentioned, the cooking gas, for example. Okay, it's not working properly, but it was this government that really took it forward. Okay? So underlying this exclusionary growth, management of the media also is, there are programs and things that are happening which are, you are able to say that all that is not just a message, but actually there is concrete stuff going on. Okay, you can ignore the NREGA program, you can ignore the National Food Security Act. Okay, and books like this, I do that. Okay, you can say that these are written by academics, but then these should be taken forward by journalists, political workers, etc., to counter the message with what is actually happening on the ground. Now, sometimes the data that you have to work with, which we used to work with earlier, are themselves manipulated. And that's what has been happening recently. But there, I think our work is to unearth other forms of more accurate information to counter this. Now, this is very, very difficult. We haven't been able to do it really in the past 5 years, but I hope we can, in the months ahead, perhaps.
Concentrate on what you began with. Admittedly, you spoke only 90 seconds, so your beginning and end was not very far away. On the other hand, I'm talking about the first 11 seconds, right? And I think you said that there's a minority here which can understand it also really, but there's a problem of majority in understanding. I think that's really a very central issue. It's a central issue of, I believe, politics. Namely, the in a political context, if you are thinking afresh, you're bound to arrive at new ideas which have not been aired before. And what I say, by the way, is a very good discussion. If you're interested, I'll give you a reference. That Antonio Gramsci, the Marxist Italian, who established the Nodo Novo, which is a great journal, which was also a high-class philosophy journal, but happened to be a popular journal. And there he discussed that the thing, he said, here's the problem. I believe, he argues, that every human being is a philosopher because we use a language. And then every time you use a language, there are certain ideas that you have to marshal, utilize, and adapt to your reasoning. And yet, by the way, that's a similar thought to Noam Chomsky. At the same time, you arrive at a new idea. Your problem is extraordinary. By using language which is understood only because everyone agrees on the meaning, you want to say something false consciousness. The idea is that these are very complicated things, but these are not beyond reach of anyone. Now, whether Marx was right on that, I don't know. On the whole, in many respects, he proved not as successful as he thought he might be. And yet the basic idea was widespread. And even when you think about 1875, his last book, Critique of Quota Program, when he is talking, he's saying the German Workers' Party are wrong to assume giving workers the right to what they have produced is a bourgeois right, because ultimately human beings have different needs. And therefore what you need is a society from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Now, and then he said, is it likely that we can do it now? And he said, no, we can't. Can't they do it in German Workers' Party? Do it now? No. So he ultimately, beginning with a blast on German Workers' Party, and by the way, since this was an academic place, you always look at that. It is one of Marx's most interesting writing, also his last book. He talks about why German Workers' Party is wrong in thinking that labor is the source of all value, and he said that's not the case. Nature is also, and that's where you get an environmentalist thought in 1875. Now the fact is, other people think that he conceded defeat, that you couldn't do it then, and he said, well, in some uncertain communist future we will do it. That's a wrong thing, but if you go through the evolution bit by bit, going even by very unlikely characters like Bismarck, the welfare state, and the National Health Service, you see the echo of the same ideas coming back again and again. So it's not lost. The articulation is very straightforwardly simple in 17 pages. You need a much more complex thing. But when Anourin Bevan was opening the Manchester First National Health Service Hospital, he was in the same kind of territory as Marx was in 1875, arguing against the German Workers' Party's self-satisfaction with people being paid according to their productivity and work. So I think it's that potential of moving from minority to majority which makes politics what it is. And in the context when we meet a problem like those problems outlined in this book, when you want a change, I mean, if you are, I don't know, I may be prejudiced, it seems to me that if you are an Indian and if you don't want to change in the way education, healthcare, social security is done in India, there's something wrong with you. And in order to eliminate that, you need clear articulation. What is it? How are you going to have healthcare for everyone? How would that be possible? That's a question that occurred again and again in some ways from other thought, like John Rawls' theory of justice. How is it possible that we can have a system of justice that's accepted by all? That question that's coming up again and again is the meat of social philosophy, is the meat of politics, and is the meat of what we are fighting for. And ultimately, you know, there are lots of things that's wrong, and I'm glad that the book discusses it. But ultimately, it's that understanding that we are doing. It's a bit like what I said about nationalism, seeing it as humanism, humanitarianism. Similarly, there is something in the minority perspective which is shareable by all, provided we make the effort to share it, and provided politics can play a part which moves one from secluded philosophy to a acceptable philosophy, understandable by all. So I'm really delighted you raised that question.
May I just add to add to what Amartya said in response to your question, Dadabhai Nauroji, who wrote Poverty and Un-British Rule, was the first man of color, as they called him, to be in the House of Commons, elected by a difference of 3 votes. So Nauroji was called narrow majority in the British House. But he had a huge impact.
I think we have to hold on to that thought.
I just want to ask.
Oh, no brushing. Okay.
Very, actually the response to the last question provoked this thought. When this wrong direction started, really, it is, I think, I don't think that the ideas or the politics which brought this wrong direction into play represented the majority opinion of this country. I mean, many analysts have pointed out that the BJP actually did not come with a majority vote. You know, they just got about 1/3, less than 1/3 of the people voting for them, and you know, one can go on about the problems with the Indian system, how such a party gets so many seats. The point is that when we are talking about it today, in the context of what is happening, what is going to happen in the next 1 month, this wrong direction, is it the reason why this wrong direction has not been reversed, or it is still looking tentative? Is it only because of, you know, some tactical reasons, or is it because we are still a democracy, a functional democracy, at least on paper, or is it something that is missing in the effort, the political effort, in stopping this quantum jump in the leap in the wrong direction, or taking it in a more progressive or desirable direction?
Okay, you have of course raised the topic for another seminar, but I'm going to hand this over to Zoya.
No, I just want to add to what has just been said apropos this very interesting question. I think it's not just that the BJP won 31% of the vote, but even if we look at the last 3 years, since December 2017, the BJP has not been doing very well. I mean, it's below par performance in Gujarat, followed by several defeats. So I think this assumption about the invincibility of BJP is something that we need to really think about, because before Pulwama and its aftermath, clearly the odds of BJP winning were not very high. Now, of course, we don't know how public opinion will shift in the light of everything that has been happening over the last 10 or 15 days. So I think there isn't a reason to be as pessimistic as your question suggests. At the same time, I'm not for a moment suggesting that the dilemmas of progressive politics everywhere are very, very high. But at the same time, I mean, if we look at our own country, surely, I think the possibilities of, let us say, the minority, what you're calling the minority opinion becoming a majority opinion is very high. And also, we should also take into account that we have a very we have an electoral system which complicates matters, and we don't often discuss the implications of the first past the post system as against, let us say, a proportional representation system. Were we to have a proportional representation system, I think that the point that you're making about majority minority would be very different.
Thanks. I want to hold on to this point that Azad said, that, with proper articulation, minority views can become majority. And I want to add to that, I think this is a step in that direction. So this book is a positive step in the right direction, which is discussing what has gone wrong in the last few years. But I would add to articulation, I think, a greater sense of fearlessness. I think maybe one of the things that has happened to us, not all of us, thank God, but many of us over the last few years, is a kind of sense of suppression, self-censorship, and an inability to express oneself as fully and as fearlessly as is often required. I have great joy in the fact that our students are much better at this than we are, and I'm really also delighted that the people in this book are showing that they're much better at this than we have been. So with that, I think we can close this discussion. I want to thank, obviously,